the first 25 verses up until this moment have been decidedly um, uh, disempowering of the divine natural. Meaning, the God of Genesis, at least the one who authors this, wants us to believe that God is beyond nature. Right? The God who creates nature is not nature. God utilizes, the fingerprints are all over the editor who writes, who uses Tehom and Yam, all of these pre-existent myths of the ancient Near Eastern world in order to give our God the agency over those mythic gods. Right? Our God rules over those mythic gods, uses them as that God will. So then to get back into the pluralistic polytheistic God would be it would be a moment, it would be confusing. Again, we don't have, the text doesn't have to have such literary, economy and beauty and elegance. It could be just a moment of like, oh, we still believe in many gods. Let's go back to this, the royal we was the way that the rabbis understood it, was let us make man with the God speaking about God's self as many kings will, like in the third person, let us. And so it's a royal we, that's one rabbinic interpretation. And it shows a kind of both divine majesty and also divine humility in saying, let us. We'll get back to that in a second. Edith?
I was going to say, I think, because I think my experience of God, I'll say my, and I think this is maybe something I feel comfortable about making an assumption about people in the ancient world, but the experience of God is both singular and differentiated. We experience oneness, and then we experience all of this not oneness, and I think, however it happened, the language here just reflects that tension between oneness and the differentiated, and that they're both existing always perpetually together. And like maybe it isn't one or the other.
So the oneness, interesting. I'm curious about oneness, meaning in the notion of oneness, the way that we say oneness mystically. It's hard to know if they had that sensibility. It might have been a oneness that was more animistic, or a oneness where there was an animating diversity. We know of other ancient religions that had one God, but it was one of a full retinue of divine beings, where God was the chief amongst them. That would seem to be the way that the Bible, for the most part, views God. Even in Deuteronomy, where there is only one God, it's not there's only one God, it's God is the chief God. Right? Our God is the true God. But there are other powers. Who is, right? So there are many gods, but we have the one that's the strongest. There is certainly something like that's here, and then in later tradition it certainly becomes very pronounced that Elohim and Yud-Heh-Vav becomes the one and Elohim becomes the many. So that kind of dance between the one and the many that is mostly attributed to Plotinus and Neoplatonian later on, but it seems to be in Plato. Plato, obviously, right? Plato, then of course, those
the Demiurge. That's what I was going to say. There's a Theon, who's one god. I don't know if that was unique to Plato and Socrates or not, but he created the Demiurge because you could only create things a few steps below you. So God couldn't create man and animals because it was too below. So the Demiurge did.
So that is very, and by the way, that notion, which seems so far to us, is deeply Kabbalistic, right? Deeply Kabbalistic.
Sure.
The Ein Sof has, even the way that the Zohar in the 13th century reads the first verse of the Bible is to say that there is Reshit, and that Reshit is an energy of the divine. Reshit is Chokhmah by Sophia. It's her bat mitzvah today, and it's with Sophia, with wisdom, that God is created, right? Reshit bara Elohim. And Sophia becomes the sphere of Chokhmah, of wisdom, which becomes a kind of quasi-divine, it's called Ayin. Sometimes Chokhmah is called Ayin, Ve'chokhmah me'ayin timatzah. And so Chokhmah becomes affiliated with Ayin, which is nothingness. And so in Kabbalah, in the later Kabbalah, it has this, right? It's beyond the Ein Sof, literally and figuratively, for the Ein Sof to create the worlds. It's not possible for the infinite to create the finite. So we need to have some kind of bridge system where there's a kind of levels, right? And then the levels then eventually bring forth manifestation
Even
at the
Ein,
lowest level.
sorry, even Ein Sof. I
Is it-
know it's different languages, but
Right.
Sof.
Is
that
without
could be-
ends.
What?
Ein Sof is
I
without
know,
ends.
but it would mean without wisdom, if it was Sophia. If it's Cognati Sophia, it would be without wisdom. It's just kind of funny. It's a synchronicity.
Interesting, that's an
Thinking
interesting,
about
I hadn't thought of that, actually, that's very good. Bill, yeah, you had your hand up before.
Maybe it's open to many interpretations on purpose, because God is doing what the Hindus call Leela, is play, and
Mm.
the whole nature of this creation, for people that believe in God, it's overwhelming evidence that there's an intelligent creator in charge. For people that want to believe in a materialistic, mechanistic universe, there's all these growing scientific discoveries that keep pushing back what is supernatural. And even, the Elohim, which we can interpret as the 10 different
Sefirot.
the Christians say that that's the Trinity. We can also say maybe it's a carryover, they didn't fully edit it when they took this, like the flood story, they didn't fully edit the stories when they put it into
All of
the
those
scripture.
are options, all options.
And maybe that's part of, what
Yeah.
God wants us to do, is to engage with him in a playful way.
I love that, so you bring in Leela, and Leela is a really great, we have a very similar notion also in how about you? In Kabbalah. We even have it with Torah, where Torah is seen as Shashu'ai, the Torah is created before creation. I wanna come back to this, and I wanna move to another piece, but I wanna come back to, Leela, Eden, Bill, Lydia, and also, who said, the royal we? Yochanan, okay, Yochanan, thank you. Yochanan, I wanna come back, so I wanna weave them together. So,
That's the challenge.
the Nasa is certainly a polemically important moment in Jewish history where Christians claimed that this was a very clear evidence that God was in the plural. And for Jews, it was a very important point for us to many of the interpretations came to try to more elegantly explain why God would, it's a difficult thing to say, it's a very difficult moment, In other words, it's kind of, you can score points for the Christians here in this moment, it's like a very strong, but we don't have to be in a polemical relationship with our Christian brothers and sisters on this point, or with any other religious tradition on this point, because there's something very beautiful. Kabbalah itself eventually makes God, eventually describes the divine in both in the unique, intense oneness, which, by the way, Christians also believe in, the very intense oneness. But it's just the mystery of how oneness and three. But we have a very similar notion of 1 and 10, and it's all one. Okay, and scholars can debate, but it's like there is something being given over here where the divine is saying, I am all things, not just one. I am all pronouns and none. I am all of creation and none of it. It is very much in the tradition of Advaita and of Zen and there's something I think something very beautiful about that. And even if that isn't where we began with the kind of what the text probably really meant, it probably didn't have anything to do with the Trinity. It definitely didn't have the Trinity. It had nothing to do with. It was a very early text that is very hard for us to decipher. But I think that the more we look at it, the more like a koan or a riddle, it becomes more and more radically beautiful. Like it just has many facets. For example, I think the most beautiful understanding of this might be the more contemporary understanding, which says, if you look at evolution and look at where consciousness has evolved from, it clearly has built upon all of the previous stages of life, right? So we aren't divorced from all of creation. We are transcending it and including all of it. We have within us all of organic and inorganic, and all of life is within this thing called human consciousness. So we are a plurality. We have been made, as the Midrash says, God asked for all of creation to contribute a little piece that no one would say, I created human beings, right? That's it, we all did it together. And I think it's also very beautiful as a moral and ethical teaching where the rabbis say, this teaches you that every great leader should ask for advice from the ones who work for them. right? All the angels worked for God, and God said, hey, let's do this together. We're Google, we have to have a bottom-up mentality in this organization, right? We need to, like, it's called, that God said, give me Eitzah. God came to the angels and said, hey, can you help me? I have this really big project called humanity, and I need your help. And so this showed, say, the moral and ethical teachings in the Musar, that Anvitanuto shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it shows the humility of God, that God was willing to ask for advice on a very important project. Yeah.
I just wanna say, going with your phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, that all of the ones before, God said, you know, there are animals and there's an expanse and then there's water and there's sky, and so there are all of these, phylogenic elements.
Yes.
And then then he says, let us.
Right.
So phylogeny is recapitulating
Right,
ontogeny
exactly.
in the very
In the verse,
substance of the
exactly.
verse.
Right, in the verse.
And it's really, you cannot really disconnect it from 25.
Of course,
Because
okay.
God did all these animals, and now he says to all these animals,
Let
let's do
us,
it.
Right.
exactly,
Yeah, that's exactly what
Right?
you were pointing at.
yeah.
So if you look at, now let's look to verse 27. Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo. Now God creates humans in God's tselem. Tselem, T-Z-E-L-E-M. Tselem. B'tselem Elohim bara oso. In the tselem of Elohim bara oso, it's like a almost chiastic, right? So God creates B'tselem, and then B'tselem bara oso. It's kind of it returns on itself. Zachar u'nekeva, with a zachar is masculine, and nekeva with the one who has holes, bara oso, usam, that's the woman, right? Nekeva, nekev,
What does Mecca mean?
right? Nekev is a hole, a hollow.
Ah, very interesting.
And the Zachar, never mind.
No, zachar is it's like,
Is it
It's
related
called
to this core?
memory.
To remember?
but here it's very, so what is the last part? The whole verse is absolutely vital for a million reasons. One is, what does it mean that God created us in God's image? Right, after we've said, let us make man in our image, then it goes on and says, well, it's really the divine image. Okay, so we're made up of all creation, now we have God's image in us. What might that have meant when it was written, and what did it become? And you should know that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this is the source for the unique dignity of every human being, is from this verse. Right? It says, not that other traditions didn't have this, but credit where credit's due. So what did it mean? What did it mean at that point in human history? What do you think those who authored this meant when they said that we were creating God's image? Just try to remove some of the layers of what's computer idolatrous and what's not.
I just don't know whether it's relevant, but we have a creative impulse.
Okay, so great. So let's look at what Alina just did. That she said the image of God means something other than the image of God. In other words, she took a quality of the divine, and she then said human beings have that, just as God has that quality. So, in other words, she narrowed what image meant to a particular characteristic or quality within the divine, which itself is kind of like you have to say where you got that from. Well, meaning like there are a lot of different understandings of what God is, but in our understanding of God, we kind of, if I say B is like A, then I say, well, what is A like? In what ways it be like A? So then you have to kind of have a certain set of what A is like, or what are the properties of A. And you say, oh, B is like A right? So, Tselem Elohim, how many qualities does God have?
Oh.
To later text, 13.
3.7, 2.14, we have 5. So how many qualities are in A, as in God? So you chose one of an infinity of qualities, but it's interesting. So it could be that, and many have said this, almost all of the medieval scholars, when they look at this verse, given their own assumptions about what God is and what God isn't, what human beings can, right, what B can borrow from A, they said, oh, just as God is creative, we are creative. What's another one, classic image of God element? Just as God is rational. Right? God, just as God is rational, we are rational. What else? What's another one?
Compassion.
As God is compassionate, we are compassionate. Chaotic, right, no, so that wasn't. Right, no, but let's just stay with what we, just God has free will, this is the most famous one, just as God has free will, human beings are endowed with free will. God is a free agent, nobody can hinder God's free agency, so we are all free agents, right, in the moment, so to speak. And we are all, what else is that, the last one we'll do that's in the classic rabbinic mode. Just as God is a speaking being, so too human beings are endowed with speech.
And
Right?
Matt-
So let's each one of these has a problem. Each one of them has a problem, each one of them is limiting, and each one of them ultimately leads to not to the elevation of humanity, but to the elevation of parts of humanity and the denigration often of other parts. Let's, for a moment, your Loberbaum wrote a book on this. He's a scholar, a professor of law. Wrote a book about what it might have meant, looking at all of the places in the Torah where this phrase, image of God, is used, what it might mean. And looking at rabbinic literature too, how they might have understood it before it was kind of redone. You know what he says the original meaning probably meant? Anybody? Come on, be radical with me here. What might, if I say I'm created in the image of God, what might it mean?
God is a moral being.
So are you.
Morality, okay, but that's not very radical. Be a little bit more radical.
Creative.
Creative we already had.
That one.
Touch,
We're all God?
we're all God. We are all mini me's. Each and every human being, in Loberbaum's study of this term, that this body, this human form, not my intellect, not my rational capacities, not my free will, not my speech capacity. Remember, if you can't speak, that would be a problem. If you're a little bit less than rational, who's less than the children are not yet rational? People who have cognitive difficulties aren't fully rational in our understanding in the West of what rationality means. Right? Women were included there. Right? So in the later understandings of what the divine quality that we borrow, it almost always both elevated us above animals, which was also and limited us. And Loberbaum wrote, if you look at other places in the Torah, for example, if someone, this is a very unfortunate case, but there were capital punishment in Jewish life at one point for murderers and so on. If someone was a murderer and he had capital punishment, I don't believe in capital punishment. But in the Torah says if someone were hung and they were a criminal, you still have the responsibility to take their body down for the dignity of their body. And in that phrase, in Deuteronomy, it says for the dignity of the divine body. What could that mean? Right? Presumably once you're dead, your rational soul, your intellect, your capacity to speak and so on, all of that is no longer there. In other places, for example, in the Midrashim, there's a great Midrash, rabbinic story about a famous sage named Hillel, a couple thousand years after the Torah was written, who would go to the bathhouse every Friday before Shabbat. And his student said to him, why do you go to the bathhouse? He said, well, just as Caesar has a statue of Caesar in the bathhouse and all of the attendants clean Caesar's statue, I go to the bathhouse to clean this divine statue. It's a mitzvah, he said. There are scores of these. I did all the research on it. It's really amazing that when it says later on in this book of Genesis, if you murder someone, you have spilt the blood of another human being, you are not guilty of homicide, you are guilty of deicide.
Right.
When you kill another human being, you have killed a part of God.
That's not in the Torah.
And that's in the Torah, in the sources, the way that you understand the sources. The ancients believed, he claims, and again, there's no way of knowing this, but he claimed that to be a mini God is to then be imbued with infinite dignity and infinite value and worth. And just as one is prohibited from cursing God, one is prohibited from killing human beings because you are killing a part of God. So,
Well, save a life, save the universe.
which, when you save a life, you save the universe. So this verse, and this is where I want to get back to something that Cleva said, why it's so important in terms of also how to understand the latter part of the verse. So not only are we created in the image of God, but the image of God is neither masculine or feminine, but both and. And so this becomes the source for not the simple reading of the text is when God created the genus called human beings, there were, right, there's male and female. But no, but the rabbis say no. This verse tells us that every human being was created androgynously. Every human being, just as God is on a spectrum, God is on a spectrum of, quote unquote, right, of things created and not. Right? How funny it is to limit ourselves to like, oh, God is. And the same thing is true of speaking about human beings. They are. So the only thing we can say about human beings are they're created in as many gods, and that they have within them this full spectrum of Zachar, Nekeva, and this gives rise to the rabbinic teaching that when God creates human beings, He creates them du partzufim, with two faces. One face, very from the plate, very much like the symposium. That human beings are created with, right, androgynously, a male face, a female, and that, of course, it becomes, unfortunately, in a kind of very heteronormative world, becomes the source for, you know, a very binary construction. We're sawn in half and they were looking for our other half, and it actually leads to a binarism, but it's not originally supposed to, it doesn't have to lead in that direction. I just wanted to point that out in verse 27. I know that Ilana's had her hand up.
I just had a question. Is
Yeah.
it, in the idea of every mini god, is it that each person is a mini god, and or the collective of all people are the mini gods? Like, is it?
Yes.
Yes, and, yes, right. So, right, it would be idolatrous for the rabbis, I think it does for the Bible to imagine that any one person has all of divinity, as it were, in them.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between saying, you know, I am God, and so are you, and saying I am God. And for the rabbis, the former would be idolatrous. And I think also the Torah is very clear that even though Moses is called Isha Elohim, the man of God, he isn't, right, infallible. And by the way, the God of the Bible is also not infallible, but whatever. But there isn't a sense that it only exists within Moshe. It's something that he can give. It's something that each person can have. So, yeah, it's a collective and an individual, both and.
But just thinking about like that thing that you're talking about, sort of the oneness and the indivisibility, and like just the different constructs of the divine elements being in each person, but that you can't see the fullness unless it's
Totality.
totality.
Yeah. I mean, the thrust of the Torah is certainly in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
In later rabbinic, you know, how we reconcile this with a very particular tradition that sees, you know, Jews as chosen and so on, and it's certainly clear from the Torah that chosenness is not an intrinsic hierarchical superiority.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we are those who have tzelem but non-Jews, or those who are not Jewish. You know, that they don't have it. It becomes part of Jewish tradition, unfortunately, later. Which, you know, there are always these accretions around needing to be more than others. But every human being is imbued with infinite dignity in the Genesis narrative. And it becomes, again, to like leapfrog all the way to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This becomes the source for, you know, the innate dignity that human beings have. And this is irrespective of your IQ, your socioeconomic status, your gender, your sexual orientation. This is given as being a mini divine being, which is kind of beautiful that this highly, I think, early understanding of our dignity also it kind of accords with the mystical insight that each person is a whole world. And so I kind of like that, because it's not often that the mystical and the deeply pagan, and this feels like it in a way, you know. Yeah, Yochanan, and then I'm sorry, Wendy first, maybe Yochanan. Wendy, yeah.
you know, if you look at the previous pasuk and it talks about our image, and then in this one it says, God created man in his image, it's like, it's sort of like, you know, God made like an executive decision. It's like, I was thinking about including all of you, and then I changed my mind, and I said, no, just me.
Hmm.
Like, what happened to our image? Like, how did it go from one pasuk to the next, and like this radical change happened in how humans were to be created?
That's a very, very good question. I hope everybody followed that. Did everybody follow that?
Is that clear in the Hebrew, because it's still
Yes,
Elohim?
in the Hebrew, no, in the Hebrew it's very clear. It's actually, it's stark. So, excellent question. I'll give you so, again, I think that there's an editorial problem. If we want to just be Occam-like, Occam's, elegance would demand that this is an editorial issue. But, be that as it may, that's not really a good answer, because we still live with it. So it's too simple. So the answer I give is that verse 26. You can read verse 26 in light of verse 27, or verse 27 in light of verse 26, or you can say that they're completely at odds with each other. So one of those three are your options, right? So the way that I would like to learn it and read it is to read verse 27 in light of verse 26, and not the other way around. You're reading it as, verse 27 comes, and as an executive, I hate to use that term now, but like an executive order is undermining what verse 26 had laid out as a beautiful utopic vision. I would rather see verse 26 utopia as now being included in verse 27's seemingly regressive policy. Meaning, verse 27 says, God goes back and says, no, I'm going to make man in my image. And that image now is, in light of verse 26, an image that includes everything. That my image, you might have thought that my image is separate from all of creation, but my image isn't. My tselem, my image, God says, includes all of creation. I'm going to include, right, calling it my image as if to say, it's my image. But everybody who's read verse 26 will know, when I say my, I mean our. Right? And if anybody asks,
Because Hashem is inclusive of all the others.
All of it, right? So we human beings, in our own consciousness, include our divinity is not different from the degrees or the levels that we include. So if we want to imagine ourselves as many gods, we have to also include the parts of us that are reptilian, that are the limbic system, all of the different parts of consciousness that we include in us, so that we might not say, oh, it's only divine when you are acting, there's a lot, we include multitudes, to just paraphrase.
It's dangerous.
It is dangerous.
Is the implication of that.
That's why, and the implication of that is that's why we need the rest of the Torah.
Yeah.
Right? We need the rest of the Torah because, because
Well,
we
that's
have hubris,
Shabbat
because
tzvi
we get, so, do we have 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
5 minutes, okay, 5 minutes. Unless there's another, really pressing comment. Yochanan.
All I want to, people just said that, this opens the way to two interpretations of what we are. One of them is arrogant and dominating,
Yes.
and the other one is humility and responsibility.
Exactly.
And that's exactly from here on, you have to really either make your own decision or read the entire Torah and decide based on that.
Well, that's the tension with all the different characters of the Torah.
It's the tension within the Torah, but it's also the tension here. I love that, Yochanan, the way you're bringing that, because it is implicit and, to some extent explicit, but it's implicit meaning we read this that way, that we have this within us. Both directions are within us. And some would argue also within God. The evolution of God's character also in the Torah is very profoundly participating in this between domination and participation, domination, commanding, and compassion and being with. And so this is our story, this is our mythic story. And I also want to say that this literature, if you compare this literature to other creation stories, this literature is very different You know, to have a God who is, there are deep implications for Jewish history and Jewish psychic development that are a part of this story that we've told for 2,000 years. And we've told it in many different ways, and we've heard it in many different ways. And so, I just want to bring to mind not just the dark things that we heard, and the way that it was understood and misunderstood by Christian translation and so on, or mistranslation, but also the God of this first chapter of Genesis is empowering human beings to go beyond their own nature, because God overcame nature too. Like, that's the most important. Yechezkel Kaufman and others point this out. You might gloss over this when you read Genesis, but it wasn't lost on our ancestors. That this God was a God who created nature, and because of that, could overcome nature. And that quality was also a quality that Jews strove to emphasize, right? And sometimes overcoming nature meant repressing it. That was a problem. But overcoming nature in the sense of being able to harness it and to not be a subject of nature, but to be one who was slightly part of it, but also differentiated from it, was vital for human evolution, right? The fact that we could imagine ourselves going beyond what was given, right? That was an important piece of being a tzelem. Very important. That's part of what creativity is. So I know that I just opened up a whole other can. I know. It's so hard. It's so hard to go through. All right. Since we have 2 minutes left, I'll take a comment from Melina, and then from Wendy.
I'm thinking about before this whole story, like before man, this book is written to help us live in this world. But what was it like? It's like this is just a guide for people. This is a way of directing our thinking about it. That was somehow siphoned down through this view. So I can't even put it in words, but I was thinking of before the Torah. It's like, this is just a frame that's given to us to work with and struggle with.
Yeah.
But it is creation of humans too, this book. I mean, so it's somewhat limited by the view that humans would impose on how to understand all this. I mean, I can't put it in words better, but I'm just trying to think. We're talking about it as if this is a truth that existed before. There's a point before this. I don't know, just trying to.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, if you believe, like, traditional Jewish perspective for a couple thousand years was that there was no point before the Torah was given. The Torah was already,
Right.
always. Like, God looked into the Torah and created the world, the blueprint, pre-exists the world, and so on. Even within that view, the truth is it was given at Sinai. So, in a more modern critical understanding, obviously there are other pre-existing myths that the Bible is late to, and then what the beauty of the Bible is that it picks up those myths and then it creates its own different myth. Not throwing those out, it actually includes them and in some ways changes them, so we kind of know, because we do know other myths, and we do know what was before the Torah, as it were, mythically, and the worldviews and the frames. And what's remarkable about the Torah is that it's actually a very different frame. It has similarities too, but it has very distinct distinctions, very distinct differences. And that those distinct differences actually inform a worldview. And a worldview actually itself is important because a worldview informs thinking. And thinking informs speaking. And speaking informs behavior. And so many of the scientific, right, it's very clear that many people study, many of the greatest scientific discoveries and scientism itself, including empiricism and empirical method, all those things, were a direct outgrowth of a notion of progress. And a notion of progress is deeply rooted in a non-circular understanding of history. And the mythic, animistic, and pagan understanding, at least, again, I'm allowed to call it pagan, there are those who say you're not, but I'm going to give myself permission. It sounds very condescending, but it's not. But there is a certain orientation to the universe that was, at least certain scholars from the West call circular. Right, Mircea Eliade and other scholars of myth, where the notion that you are right back where you began, over and over again, kind of itself is a very beautiful mythic understanding of time. The time doesn't differentiate. Time itself is always, you're always really right back in the primal original moment. But the book of Genesis begins with linearity. And it lays out a progressive model of where nature itself has cycles. The God of the Bible is greater than those natural elements in being able to include them in what would seem to be a hierarchical progression. And that then becomes the groundwork for the story of Genesis, the stories of Genesis, and then eventually Exodus and liberation. What's really beautiful about the Jewish tradition, I think, is it never threw out circularity, but it included both the circle with the line. We are right back where we were, but we're slightly different. That's how we began. That's how we began this morning, right? The archetype of the Torah is that whatever happened to Genesis will happen to every successive generation, but it's not exactly the same, right? In every generation, we are required to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, which is true, but we're in the Ukraine and we're in America, right? So there is this notion of historical progress within a kind of eventuality of circles. And so the ancients got that, and the rabbis got that, and that led to the sense that it could get better, right? A caste system, and Buddhism had this too. Buddhism broke out of Hinduism and certain models of circularity. You could break the cycle of samsara. And so there's a lot happening in these stories. So we're gonna close because we have a bat mitzvah inside, and her name is Sophia, and I have to go to her. We're gonna pick up in the first verse of the book of Genesis this morning at about 11:15. Please join us, and then God willing, next week we'll be here for As the Torah Turns, another Shkoach, everybody.
And there's a year that people could get to know.
David, the Israeli Supreme Court is built on the theme of straight lines and circles.
I want to hear more about that.